one work?
Yeah. Okay. Hello. Hi, I'm KevNr. This is Mike Dop We've been friends for about 15 years. We actually work together now, and we're going to kind of talk about how Dop and I got to know each other a little bit. We grew up in the same town. So we're from this town, Quincy, Illinois, which if we have a map there, but as I like to describe it, if you're a chubby guy facing California, it's the belly button of Illinois. And this analogy also works great because East St. Louis is the balls of Illinois. Basic Communications Limited was very similar to probably a lot of your first ISPs. I previous to that had been using a lot of dial-up, and I'll go back for a second. This is Dop, maybe a little bit younger than he was in some of this stuff, and this is me pretty much, at this time. Early ISP used POTS dial-in lines, initially kind of 24, then 48 POTS dial-in lines. We'll talk about the architecture a little bit. It was serving at its peak about 1,500 people, and what you can tell, Quincy is kind of not necessarily a suburban area, but between St. Louis and Springfield, Illinois, it's about the biggest town around. So it was kind of the hub for this. And actually, I felt in talking to other people from rural areas, I think Quincy had the advantage of having some people that were pretty interested in computers and kind of an early start on this stuff. I think, BCL probably was founded in 93 or 94. I think I became a registered user in 95. I don't know, probably you around the same time. And we came, before that, dialing into Chamber of Commerce, BBSs, stuff like that. This was our first, real internet connection outside of the interfaces through CompuServe or something like that. So it was eventually acquired by Access US in kind of 1997 and 1998, and we'll talk a little bit about what happened after some of this stuff in this today. It was founded by kind of three early 20s tech guys who had kind of gone to college, come back home, didn't know what they want to do. Two of them were brothers, and one of them just a partner in enterprise. And eventually the brothers kind of got pushed out, and Kane here, you'll see, is bought the ISP out from under them, and then operated it independently as a sole proprietorship after that. It was staffed by a pretty eclectic group of guys, both in the kind of staff admin side, one of which was our friend who was kind of the same age when he was 17 and 18. So the wheel group here, so we talked about the owner. Our friend was MRX. There's this kind of like 5'2", 120-pound guy with a ponytail to kind of his butt, and he was a really eccentric Unix admin. We'll talk. There's one story that kind of hones in on that. But the first time I really met him, I went to this like user group for Perl Unix, and I couldn't really tell what was going on. It looked like he was IRCing, but what he had done is he was using the Emacs shell interface to bring up kind of a raw socket to an ISC server, and he was actually using Emacs as an IRC client, but he didn't have like the benefit of an IRC client's ability to auto-respond to like CTCP pings or something like that. So he was actually manually having to send the ping response back to the channel, and like was actually basically speaking the raw protocol. So that's like on the air of like, oh, well, that was kind of really cool and weird. But then he also does like crazy other things. So he was more concerned probably with the coolness of what he thought he was doing than necessarily always the right classical Unix thing to do. There was other staff there that wasn't in the wheel group. And Dop's got a story about one of those guys too. So we're kind of going to talk about all this stuff is long washed over. Otherwise, we wouldn't be talking about it. It was kind of a different world back then, more to the point. Some of it might actually have felt like a bigger deal back then than it would now, just because there's no pursuit of any type of cybercrime. But we're friends with, just 2 days ago, MRX called me about some job advice, and we're still friends with, Kane, the owner. And I actually ended up working for an ISP with these guys later on, so none of this stuff really matters anymore. So we wanted to kind of talk about it in the spirit of the old school Notacon stuff. there's kind of three, Dop and I are here today giving the talk. Somebody who's still a good friend of ours and works probably 60 feet from Dop in another office where he's at. He was sort of the de facto leader. He's probably the strongest Unix and programmer among us, and had a really good knack and was a little bit probably more bold than me. And I was a little bit younger than both Dop and him. But so there's me. I was kind of 12, 13, 14 when this stuff happened. Dop was a little bit older than me, and Maniac was Dop's age. So what did this ISP look like? Well, it looked like a lot of early ISPs, and that's to say not much by today's standards. There was a pretty eccentric group of multiple Unix systems, which made it a really great train set for us and the people that owned it, meaning we got to see how like different types of Unixes did different things. There was two kind of principal next step boxes. They were turbo color slabs with, which are like 33 megahertz RISC boxes with 32 megabytes of RAM at the time. There was an SGI Indy running IRIX 5 something or another. A couple just starting to get into Linux servers. They had one Slackware box, and then kind of later on managed some Linux box and replaced some of this aging commercial Unix stuff with that. The actual original dial-in infrastructure, I said, was about 48s and eventually 96 POTS lines. And actually, Kane, the owner of the ISP, I once recall complaining that he only got one phone book because he owned 96 lines. And at the time, phone books were actually useful. So it was kind of weird. And then it was like the coolest Blinky-like setup of all time, because all the modem rack was a whole bunch of US Robotics Sportster modems, and he had bought aftermarket chassis for them so that to pull them out of the external modem shell and then rack mount them, and it provided power and kind of a rack management solutions for having 60 modems in a rack. And these telebit net placers were just serial terminal servers. They supported Radius, initially, they weren't using Radius, and then eventually they did use Radius for dial-in authentication, but there was originally password files on each one of them. They were Intel boxes, like i386 something, or probably 386 SX boxes. They booted off of a floppy with their own OS, and it was essentially just a serial line terminal server, and it did have the capability to run SLIP and PPP. Most of the users started off having shell access that they could initiate point-to-point PPP connections afterwards, and then people got kind of migrated over to just having PPP as their default base. There was a couple of the news server ran NT, and before that, I think it ran some type of Windows OS before that. But they actually got their news feed via satellite because they had probably 512K of bandwidth to start, and they couldn't consume the whole news feed, so they had a service that was satellite download based where they could keep that off their primary connection. It was just a /24 network to start, 199.3.14.0/24, and they had a Cisco 2500 XL gateway with a kind of a FRAC T1 to Sprint turned into a full T1. And eventually, when they got bought, they got a second T1, but they had no way to balance the routes, so they set the default gateway outbound on the T1 where their routes weren't being advertised, so it was just using 10% outbound connection, and all of the stuff would come in on the other line. So it was kind of a crude way to load balance, and it actually probably caused more problems than it was worth with asymmetric stuff. Eventually, they got away from the POT stuff, and they had some Ascend Max boxes doing the dial-up stuff, and they had like some type of HP managed hub. And it was crazy because when I was a kid, this stuff seemed really like complicated and glorious. And by the time I was like 21, I could have probably rebuilt it out of spare parts in my basement. So the next stuff was really cool for me to see, because it was probably the first Unix system I had shell on.
Yeah, absolutely.
So this is the first time we were exposed to Unix, and it was kind of eccentric and cool. Here I put up just a picture side by side of what the Windows comparative at the same time. So this is like 1993, 94, where Windows for Workgroups 3.1.1, and so a lot of people were running still 3.1 compared to the Next graphical interface, which actually wasn't X Windows based. It was a proprietary interface. But Next is something that Steve Jobs basically started after he got forced out of Apple. So if you can imagine, the iPhone aesthetic and everything being brought into commercial class Unix workstations, that's pretty much what Next was. Had a really modern, sleek UI. The thing that was kind of jaw-dropping for me is when I saw the graphical disk partitioner, because disk partitioning at the time in like DOS or Unix or anything else was always like fire up fdisk, manage these archaic tables and stuff like that. And here you got the disk represented as a pie chart, and you could kind of slide and do whatever you wanted. It was pretty cool, if not pretty useless, because we don't have that today. But it had a lot of neat things. Probably the biggest pain that I remember about the interface was that you actually had no really great browser candidate. OmniWeb was available, and that's actually made by the same people that make OmniGraffle today or something like that. But there wasn't a lot of great browsers. So what they had, and you couldn't even compile it to run on Next, but what they did use was a commercial piece of software that added X Windows server capability to Next called Coexist, so that they could render some of that stuff off of the SGI or other systems and remote display it on. So that's how they, and this, I guess I should say also, it's kind of it's weird for me to think that back then all these core Unix systems to their architecture were simultaneously being used as workstations for the admins and everything like that. There was no separations of duty between where you sat and the server supportability. So kind of the easy stuff that, and this is kind of as a younger, person at the time getting into computers and Unix, and starting to kind of walk the line on stuff that felt safe to do or was at least simple enough to do. The password trust was using YP or NIS, basically password sharing. So you could get a copy of the shadow file by compiling YPCat and then running it. So, and actually at the time, the best cracking software I had or knew about was available for DOS 6.2. So I would use Trumpet WinSock, dial in, do this stuff, download the file, then reboot back into DOS, or exit Windows, get into DOS, and run this cracking program overnight until my dad would tell me that he had to do some work or something, and there was no way to pause it and all weird stuff. But about 75% or so of the user passwords were dictionary crackable, even on that DX266, with a kind of a 4 or 5 megabyte password file. Games we played, with each other in just terms of annoyance. The TalkD servers were pretty universally deployed, where you could, if you knew what the host name was of a U of I server, you could look to see who was logged in using the finger protocol. And if you wanted to send a chat request to them, we had this network chat in TalkD thing. But the secret was that all the terminals were really sensitive to binary character sets getting sent to them. And this might happen to people even today. If you cat the wrong file or something like that, you'll see your terminal character set get screwed up. You might have to type reset or whatever. So we used to use that by connecting to those systems, using a flash. Basically, the tool is called flash.c. It would connect to those systems and put those binary characters into the user ID request field of the submitting user and send it to the target user, and it would just screw up people's terminals. One of our buddies did this cute little thing. I don't know how many people are familiar with just Unix rights. We don't usually use it that much more anymore, but if you still today on a Unix system, if you're a root user or whatever, you can send something to the terminal. This guy sent a message to our friend who was working as staff, and then just waited. He never controlled D out of it. So that way he had that line open to them, and he waited for a long time, and then just typed and sent the data as a forgery of what the message request would look like from Kane, and then told him to change the root password. It didn't work, but it was pretty clever, and just a pretty big gap in write. And I think now I probably haven't received a legitimate write message for 12 or 13 years. So Still a really big time for IP level trust with .rhost files. This was pre-Mitnick, where Mitnick actually used that IP sequencing attack and kind of popularized and notarized that thing. So there was a lot of user-to-user trust mechanisms set up where you could use our login and configure it so that you could jump between servers on your own account pretty easily. And occasionally we'd gain access to something and then use the rlogin trust just to expand our network of hosts. This guy also had a pretty cute thing because there was a lot of snooping in people's shell accounts and things like that at the time. And he just left a file in his home directory called runme and would wait until non-suspecting other shell account users would snoop in his home directory. And when they ran it, it would make a copy of bin bash, set it to suid them, and submit it to a file, a list of shells that he kept. So, once people, kind of were snooping around and browse me, and if you were stupid enough to run this runme script, he would have basically your shell access. And I think he said at one point he got 10 or 15 shells like that. So I'll turn it over to Dob.
All right. You guys hear me okay with this? So with Kevin talked about the next windowing system and how it wasn't compatible with X and coexist and stuff. And the admins would get used to displaying Netscape off other systems. And this is back before the days where they were still using Xhost, and they got really complacent in using Xhost Plus and things like that. And there was I guess it was in the 96, 97 timeframe, these three commands, xwd, xwud, and xev. And the first two would dump the screen, just your X display, whatever was being seen by whoever was using X would just dump that into an image file, and then its companion would then uncompress that or whatever and display it to you. So whatever was on the shell, we could see, whatever images they were looking at, news groups they were reading. It was all available to us. And also the xev, it was even more interesting because it would just intercept any X events coming between the X server and the X client, which means we can then get keystrokes for any of their X terminals. So this is how we captured a lot of the root passwords and stuff that were floating around in their network, just because of simple Xhost Plus. And then we'd obviously just set Xhost Plus in other people's shells at that point. To propagate. It
wasn't just that they set Xhost Plus for the entire world to remote display shells, but there was a permanent trust established between Monolith and Onyx, where each one, the display mutually trusted the other one. So you could we had shell accounts on both, so you could use that to remote display an event capture thing to the other system and gather those things. Just xev -display the remote host. Right. Exploiting that trust.
And that stuff, when I was trying to make these slides and get back to it, that stuff's still all available. Here's a link to it if you want to break your stuff.
Yeah.
And see if anyone finds out. But it was pretty fun. And I still use, actually, I probably shouldn't say this, but I still use some of those root passwords because there's a small group of us, like me and Maniac, especially that we know what those passwords are, so we can set those passwords for each other and say, hey, use Monolith's password to log into this. And then we can communicate that without having to actually share anything.
Yeah, I think and this stuff it kind of went away a lot in practical reasons once SSH came and had the automated XAuth forwarding stuff to do it securely. XAuth by hand was a bit of a pain to configure and do it the right way. So that's probably why you don't see as much of this, even where people are doing full, X displays and running X servers. The XAuth is so easy to use that it doesn't, it was a balance between it's easy to say, give that remote system, X authority.
Yeah, and it was a big problem back then because people didn't understand all of this. So people would say, well, how do I get my Netscape or my extern to display over here, to do my homework? And, you'll Google, or again, not Google, because we Lycos or whatever. Yeah. You'd Lycos back then, and the answer all over the web would be, hey, set Xhost Plus, everything works.
InfoSeek, I think I used a lot. Yeah, and this also, of course, is also susceptible to IP sequencing attacks in terms of IP spoofing because you're just trusting, by IP host you're authenticating things.
Okay, so this is So we've had root access, and we've been playing around, and everything's great, and no one really cares. But we got lazy, and they upgrade systems, and we lost all of our access. And I can't remember why we decided we needed to get it back. But I remember we were in one of my friend's basements. We're just all hanging out. And we're like, hey, we need to get root access back. How are we going to do that? And I came up with this. Well, all we got to do is boot it on a floppy. So we tried it. So this is Kevin's map of the office.
It's a photo collage. None of that stuff is real.
This is not that building.
It's a photo collage of the office.
The office itself was actually just right across the street from our junior high school. And I wouldn't really call it a duplex. It's kind of like a quadplex kind of thing. And it's like an old dentist office or something. And the admin would always sit out here in the front room with all the servers. But the radius server and modem racks were all in the back right here, right? So we got this genius plan that we were all just going to drive over there. It was like 9 at night. And my friends were going to distract the admin because he was maybe a little heavy set. We knew he wasn't going to get up.
Lazy.
He was kind of lazy. So they distracted him, and I'm like, oh yeah, I gotta go to the bathroom, which is right here, by the way, the toilet. So I go back there, and I'm like, hey man, this is no problem. I'm in the dark. I'm putting floppies in. You get the root and boot floppy, and I'm doing that, and everything's great. And then my floppy won't boot because I had a bad write when I made it. So we go to all this effort, and it totally fails. But the worst part of that is, then we have to keep playing out this scam. Well, we're just hanging out, right? But I had to go to the bathroom. But now I can't go to the bathroom because I'd already faked that I had to go to the bathroom. So I don't know. It was a great time,
and probably one of the bolder.
It was bold, adrenaline rush kind of thing. But that was stupid.
I'm sure I was at home.
Yeah, you didn't know anything about
that. This was kind of, when I was talking about that eclectic Unix admin, this was one of his more genius ideas, in which somehow he came up in his head that it was more secure for him to give ownership of his files to nobody.
Yeah.
Like the Unix, 99 nobody ID. And we couldn't really figure out why that was, but it was pretty quick to figure out how to exploit it. Because the web server ran as nobody at the time. It was before people really started separating those IDs. And so we just created a simple CGI that we could hit from the web. The web server would execute it, give us a setuid nobody shell, and then we were able to basically just use that shell, become him, use his rlogin stuff to other remote systems to give us at least a user level access to other remote systems. And I think this guy he probably had other stuff too that probably easily gave us root, setting the root.rlogin on a server to his user ID, stuff like that. Yeah, so that's just kind of the attack chain. Oh, kind of a similar thing he did is, I mentioned that Next didn't have a great browser, and I think Dot mentioned too. So they would run Netscape primarily off the SGI box, the Indie. They remote display it over. But to automate this, he once basically built a account on that SGI called Netscape, and it just auto-displayed back to his thing. And the funny thing was you could just sit down and at that user interface when it was running, IRX login services, and just type Netscape, and it would give you a default X login, and you could run whatever you wanted from a terminal launch or something like that. And once the Kane saw, I think he saw Wart do it. No, I think he saw a friend of ours do it. He was like, what the, it was one of the probably the more animated I saw him get through all this stuff in person, at least. Same type of thing with they had a HPUX system later on called HAL, and in all the user shells were set to bin false, so we couldn't log into it remotely. But if you were physically at the system, it didn't matter what your shell was set to as long as it was authorized by X. So you'd sit down, launch it. It would give you the X thing, and then you could right-click and say run, X term. So a couple of times that was used while people were distracted to gain permanent access. Backup, he used his own username as a password to the junior high library dial-up which was cracked and then used by me when I didn't want people to know who was logging in. Oh, this guy was so weird. I left my jacket. I'm 12, 13 years old. I leave my jacket at the office after like a Perl Unix SIG meeting. I forget it. I realize it, and someday after, a couple days later after school, I come to the ISP and I'm like, hey, I left my jacket here, and it's not there. And then like 15 minutes later, he comes in wearing my jacket. I mean, A, he was 25 and I was 12 and my jacket fit him. And B, it was the weirdest thing ever. That he was like, well, it was a nice jacket. I'm like, it was just gives you a little insight into his eccentricities. Yeah, but I didn't really want to wear it.
All right, so this one, and this is largely propagated by Maniac, because MRX was, I mean, this is a 97.
Yeah.
A lot of us had gone off to college. Mr. X was working at the ISP, and he did nothing all day long except play Quake, right? He was way better than us, like insane. Here we are on granted he's got like a zero latency. He's sitting right on the machine that's running the server, but even teaming up, we couldn't beat him. So what do you do when you can't win an unfair fight? You cheat. So we got a root access on the Quake server, and Maniac.
The Quake server, which was also primary DNS and radius for the ISP. Right. Like this is the timeline that we're running at.
All right, so Maniac installed a Quake mod that will number one, make us invincible, but also there was a button, because we couldn't catch him either. Like it wasn't just, oh, we're invincible and he was better than us. We couldn't catch him, so we just had to kill Mr. X button.
So anytime you'd get like even close to him, you'd just press the button.
And he was getting really upset, and because he thought he might be losing his edge, but no, he didn't care we had root on his box at all. Once he found out that it was just a joke, he's like, oh.
He was relieved.
Yeah, at least I'm still.
He was relieved that you compromised the box, but at least you didn't actually beat me at a game of Quake.
And while I'm here, I'm going to add one more Quake story, because there's a guy in college in the dorm room that was really, really into Quake. Huge into it. Play constantly. So one evening, a bunch of us, while he was playing, college dorm room, not a very big room, stole his mattress. I was on the top bunk, stole his mattress, put it above the stalls in the bathroom. So then, eventually, he's drinking Mountain Dew or whatever. He goes to the bathroom, comes out, like, hey guys, someone stole someone's bed and put it in the bathroom. It's like, yeah, it's yours.
It was probably the most addictive kind of thing back then. I mean,
yeah,
it was crazy.
It was great.
So there's kind of two tales of stack augmentation. One, after this ISP got bought and sold, Kane worked with somebody else to start an ISP, and our MRX was kind of moving on to another. He was kind of involved a little bit, but there wasn't a lot of systems administration talent in this small town. So I, at 15, was probably the most qualified system administrator to hire. So he reached out to me, and I started work from like 15 to 18. I ran the systems administration for the new ISP startup. Maniac ended up using his access after it got bought. They kind of neglected a lot of systems, so like technical support for the company he was working at, for his friends and family. He ended up doing a lot of work using his compromised access just to fix his friends and family's stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, kind of along those same lines, I had friends that they for whatever reason get their account disabled, like perhaps they weren't paying anymore. And I just re-enable it, and I mean, there's one specific case where I disabled this account 4 or 5 times. I include stuff in their dot finger, like stop disabling this account, and they just kept doing it. I never really figured out what they were thinking. Eventually, I just gave up, and I think they reinstalled it when the new owner took over.
Yeah. And then, also they stopped growing and investing in the modem pool. So in order to dial in. Or to help other people dial in, Trent and Maniac and Dot would trim people off the idle timers, so he would just drop lines off the modem pool so people could dial in for free, or have a free line to dial in. So how did this stuff end up? Really, it just got sold. BCL got acquired by Access US, later ANET. Most of the system stuff went eventually left and they migrated off all those systems. I do recall once sitting at a table and Dop logging into an Access US system with root and fixing something for his dad. So, there was some of that stuff, but largely we just moved on to other stuff. Kane kind of was the technical lead on a new ISP, which I mentioned, which I started working at, and I assume there was a lot of the same stuff going on against me. But overall, it was a pretty good learning experience for everyone involved. A couple other funny stuff that I remember happening, not necessarily hacks, but like on 96 New Year's Eve, InfoJack just started running a script that was 99 bottles of beer wall piped a wall. So everybody basically got 100 messages every minute.
I was logged in during that.
Yeah, you go back to your turtle and it's just a spew of crap from him. He was a pretty funny guy. Maniac was talking to me, and I didn't play Warcraft at the time. And he's like, "Oh, it's the best game," or whatever. And I'm like, "Oh, okay, maybe you can give me a copy of it." And I was like, I can get you a floppy disk or whatever. He's like, "Nah, I'll just email it to you." All right, so Warcraft 2, I think, was like 17 1.4 high-density floppies, and he email attached all these floppies to me. The mail server at the time, 32 or 40 mega disk, it didn't have it. And it ended up crashing the mail server coincidentally while the staff was all in like Springfield, Illinois, 2.5 hours away. And I'm not sure why, but I was on the Internet Archive site and I caught the status message for what happened. It was March 9th, which is like March 9th, 1997. While the BCL staff was away attending a meeting out of town over the weekend, our DNS went down. This resulted in the inability of our users to send and receive mail, as well as to get to the BCL homepage. It also caused some minor login problems. This problem was rectified as soon as we arrived back in town. It was rectified by RMing my mail spool. I don't know, you talk about.
And along with the maintenance of the dial-up pool, Maniac decided, well, this is ridiculous. I'm just going to give myself a static IP and make sure that that's routable back to me whenever I dial up.
Yeah, we used to have static IPs, and when they upgraded to the Max 4000s, they only let us add dynamics. So he gave himself back his static IP.
Yeah, and if anyone happened to be logged in on that IP, that they just got kicked off. It was just too bad for you.
It wasn't just like assigning the IP in the radius pool. He actually had to also install a route on the default gateway for that IP back to the terminal server he was on dynamically. So it was pretty elaborate. Yeah. The Xhost stuff that Dop was talking about caught other interesting staff behavior. It was not the most HR approved office. A lot of newsgroup activity, which in 1995 essentially means porn. There was not a lot of other useful, alt.binaries, weird stuff. BCL staff is into .org. And then so after all this stuff went away, just coincidentally, colleges started to have some interesting issues.
Yeah. So there was I think again about 97. There was pretty much all Unix machines had a problem where you'd send a very large ping packet, and the kernel couldn't handle it, and it would crash the machine. There was a situation where you're doing physics homework late at night on the day before it's due, and everything's really, really slow. You can't get the answers back because all the students are hitting the machine. But if the machine dies, then someone else is going to complain about that, and then they extend the deadline. And you don't have to worry about doing your homework. That might have happened. So this is stuff that still happens today. Directory traversal attacks. A friend of mine, this is not me. I had to retake in chemistry. And passed it fine, but the chemistry exams, he noticed he would come back from the exams pretty early because he didn't really care. He'd do his test real fast and come back, and as soon as he got back to his apartment, the exam answers were already posted. He's like, they had to have put that up there sooner than that. So we started guessing the names of these files and realized that they were being placed out there before the exam actually started. So you could just go to that website, write down all the answers, and then go to your test. Just because they named it, fall 98.html and just didn't link to it. So that was pretty fun. some of these same things, Kevin was talking about being able to grab the BCL passwords off YP. Someone might have ran a password cracker on the engineering workstation cluster at some campuses, which was noticed. But the campus cluster admin was also a friend of Kane's. So we just called him, and Kane's like, oh, yeah, I don't care about that. So that was kind of, didn't really get in trouble. But, I mean, you could have got expelled for that. So it's... another thing with the physics department here was not that great. You hit web-based homework situation. You get one answer right on a page. You usually have like 8 or 10 answers, like multiple choice things on this. They're progressively harder. And the first one's always like a true false, real easy. You get one right, it gets a little star next to it, and it creates a hidden input field in HTML, so that when you resubmit that page, it says, oh yeah, you got that one right. We'll just go on, right? But you could just copy that for all of the other ones, get one right, and then recreate the static source page, click that one, and then get all the correct answers on that page at the physics homework. I don't think they ever knew that existed. But that's...
So yeah, which AppSec is probably a more useful skill than physics in today's marketplace anyway. So yeah, does anybody have any questions? It's not necessarily a question-y talk, I get, but otherwise we can also kind of turn off the cameras, and if anybody has any story about early, mid-90s stuff that they want to share, you're more than welcome to share as well. So, any questions about anything? All right, cool. Thanks. Everyone.